dear members, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to host this session here today from sunny Beijing. It's our birthday party, as you know, and we put together a Navigator series, which is having global thought leaders basically trying to figure out where this world is heading. And today I'm very privileged to have Tom Friedman with us. Tom is an old friend of mine, and even though he is American, I actually sat with him in sweltering heat during the Olympics at the finals of soccer, Nigeria against Argentina with Lionel Messi. It was very hot, and I remember I had to explain to him a couple of rules how that game is being played. Anyhow, and wonderful to have my friend Liz with us. She's the senior fellow of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. But for me, very important, she published two great books, one on the river runs black and environmental challenge a couple of years ago. And I guess 2 years ago, it was about Xi Jinping and the new Chinese state. I couldn't think about anybody better going after Tom than Liz. And I must really say, Tom, welcome a day after you interviewed Biden and you made it a big story about his attitude towards China. I think you did this only because of this webinar. So thank you very much for the advertisement. And of course, I'm very keen, and that's why also I wanted you on the online is to deal with China. Trump should learn German. Of course, I will come back to this in a minute.
Yeah.
So, fellows, great to have you. We have 1 hour of a sparkling discussion, I'm sure, and I'll leave the field to Liz.
Great. Thanks so much, Jorg. It's really terrific to be here with you, and certainly with Tom, who is, one of the U.S.'s really top political commentators. And happy birthday also to the EU Chamber, which does just really amazing work. I think some of the best research out there on what's going on in China and the economy and trade issues. So a pleasure. Okay, so we have a big topic ahead of us, the transatlantic relationship in China. Timing couldn't be better. We have a new president, thank you very much, in the United States, President-elect Biden, who's already talking about partnership with European allies. And we have the European Union already reaching out to the soon-to-be Biden administration to talk about strategic cooperation with China over China. But before we start talking about what might be, I thought, Tom, perhaps it would be useful just to get your sense for where things stand right now with the U.S.-China relationship. What is President Trump leaving behind? Is it a mess, or is he leaving something that the Biden team can work with? I will note that you said in an interview not too long ago that President Trump is the American president that China deserves. So why don't you sort of set the scene for us? Where is the U.S.-China relationship today?
Well, first of all, York, thank you for inviting me. And I'm sorry our friend Keith Bradshaw isn't here, who is one of the first people who got us together and has been a great tutor for me. But it's Liz, great to be with you, and huge admirer of your work, and this is a real treat. So, let me start at 30,000 feet, how I see it. I think of the era of U.S.-China relations, 1979 to 2019, as an epic, and it's an epic that I think is over, and it's an epic that I would call the era of unconscious coupling. Of course, it wasn't so unconscious, but basically over those 4 decades, if you were an American company and you wanted to have a supply chain in China, you wanted to have a factory in China, you wanted to hire Chinese workers, you wanted to have your kid study in China, you wanted to have your campus have a campus in China, you could sort of basically do it without thinking about that much. And if you were Chinese and you wanted to study at Harvard or Ohio State, and you wanted to open a factory in America, you wanted to be listed on an American stock exchange, you wanted to have a partnership with an American, you could sort of do it kind of unconsciously. And so I think of it as the era of unconscious coupling, an era in which this is an exaggeration, but not entirely, where the US and China became one country, two systems, much more than US and Hong Kong in a way. And that era of US-China coupling was hugely important because it also was the engine of globalization in general. Globalization was driven by many factors and many different countries and relationships. But at its heart, the engine of this era of globalization of the last 4 decades was really driven by U.S.-China relations, that coupling. And a big byproduct of that is that the relative, and we have to underline that 3 times, but the relative peace and prosperity that the world has experienced over the last 4 decades was hugely contributed to by that China-US coupling. And therefore, the fact that I say this era is over is not something I welcome. I don't think it will make the world, I believe, less prosperous, and it will make it less secure. Um, the question is, why is it over? My view is that it starts by asking the question, how did China grow from poverty to middle income? And I think China grew from poverty to middle income with a strategy of really hard work, delayed gratification, smart investments in infrastructure, smart investments in education, stealing other people's intellectual property, non-reciprocal trade arrangements, forced technology transfer, and non-compliance with WTO rulings at times. In other words, it was a real mix, and we delude ourselves if we think it was just the latter, and China deludes itself if it thinks it was just the former. Now, for 30 of those 40 years, I would argue, the American business community was the real engine of the relationship. And its view was, yes, China's doing these things, but our market share is growing, our profits are growing. You, the U.S. government, don't mix in. Yeah, don't mix in. Okay, basically, it's okay as long as they're stealing my stuff. It's okay. We're all making money. And that started to change. Started to change for EU companies, and started to change for American companies over the last 5 to 7 years. And frankly, it was reflected in the reports of the European Union Chamber of Commerce and the American Chamber of Commerce. Anyone who is a regular visitor to China, as you've been, Liz, and I've been, you could see what was going on. That the ballast in the relationship, that was really the business community, was being deflated. And suddenly the market shares weren't what they were, the profits weren't what they were. And that then began to be reflected at the political diplomatic level in Washington, D.C. And in Brussels, where there really was this pushback. Now, parallel to that, I would argue, was a process that was inevitable. And that is that for 30 of those 40 years, China sold us what I call shallow goods. Like goods you wore on your shoulder, you wore on shoes you wore on your feet, socks you wore on your ankles, solar panels you put on your roof. They sold us shallow goods. We sold them deep goods, software, microchips, computers, things that went deep inside to their economy, literally into the walls and sidewalks of their system. And they actually had to buy our deep goods because they couldn't make them. And when we just bought their shallow goods, we actually really didn't care whether they were authoritarian, libertarian, or vegetarian. Um, but suddenly, when China could make deep goods, Huawei 5G as the sort of paradigm of that, things that would, wait a minute, go in the chatbot in my bedroom, go into the 5G of my cities, go into the walls of my businesses and communities. Suddenly, when they could sell us deep goods, the absence of a shared value structure suddenly became very important. So there was something inevitable about the end of this era, that we do not have the shared value structure to buy their deep goods right now. Now, when our primary relationship, during the Cold War, our primary conflict was with Russia. The only thing Russia could make was Matryoshka dolls, caviar, and vodka. That's all we bought from them. So we didn't really care. There was no possibility they were going to sell us deep goods. But when you have a relationship with China, which isn't really fish or fowl, they're a competitor, they're not an ally, but they're not a real, they're truly global enemy. When you have this complex relationship with a country that now can really make deep goods, but is not like the EU, it was inevitable that we were gonna hit this iceberg. So it was this change in China's development, change in the market share structure, and the fact that we have to be honest, China today is so much more open than it was when I first started going there, 30 years ago. But it's so much more closed than it was 5 years ago. So we can't kid ourselves. There's been a real turn inward. There's only one New York Times reporter left today in China, um, and uh, and so there has been under Xi Jinping a real tightening of the political control and resurgence of the Communist Party, and that too is affecting all of this. Then overlay the fact that the last dimension is that we live in a world now where everything is dual use. So when they bought our soybeans or we bought their solar panels, there was nothing dual use about a solar panel, basically. But now that everything is being digitized, everything they make and sell to us and we make and sell to them is really dual use. A phone, a motherboard, which can be sold to a civilian company and then end up down the road in the hands of a cyber company or the PLA. You have all the ingredients for a relationship that needs a fundamental restructuring. Absent that, left to its default, we're heading for a two technology world and some kind of Cold War or Cool War, whatever metaphor you want to use, between these two countries. And this age of unconscious coupling is over. Now, any company that wants to hire a Chinese has to think twice about it. Any Chinese that wants to travel to America, any business in America that wants to have a supply chain in China, suddenly there's a pause, there's a thinking. It just isn't unconscious anymore. Where it'll go, I don't know, but it will be defined in the coming years.
Okay, so that was a really great and very evocative, I think, description of how we ended up where we are. So, but did President Trump get it right? I mean, he fundamentally changed the nature of the U.S. Policy toward China, right? We moved from engage but hedge. Engagement is dead according to
Right.
many people. Moved from engage and hedge to sort of compete, counter, and contain, right? And everything was elevated from Confucius Institutes to cyber economic espionage. Everything became a threat
Yes.
of equal proportion.
Right.
And you had a lot of pushback coming from this administration, right? We've got over 300, got tariffs on over $300 billion worth of Chinese goods
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah.
Did he get it right? Was this the right response given what you've just described?
So my view is no. As I said, Donald Trump is not the American president America deserved, but he was the American president China deserved, in the sense of somebody needed actually just to put a fist in the face. Just say, okay, we're just not going to take this anymore. Okay. So that was healthy. That's always good in a relationship when you feel that it's gotten out of control. One party or the other sort of puts their foot down. The problem with Trump is he had two problems. One is Donald Trump is really good at breaking things. If you need something broken, he is your guy. Okay. You need a Paris climate agreement broken, he's your guy. You need an Iran nuclear deal broken, he's your guy. You need Obamacare broken, he's your guy. You needed the U.S. China 40-year relationship broken, he was your guy. He is really good at breaking things. He is terrible at building things. For a builder, he's a terrible builder. And that's why you see he wasn't really a builder. He was just a marketer. He just put his name on things. Why was he bad at building things? Because to build things takes patience, takes deep knowledge of all the intricacies, and most of all, takes compromise. Compromise not only with the other person, but with your own base, where you have to go back to your base and say, look, I know I promised you 100, but I got 75. That's pretty good, right? But Trump lived in a world of zero sum, and so he could sort of never go back to his base and say, well, I had to compromise pretty heavily with them. So that was one problem, one reason he couldn't build things. The other is that Donald Trump did not understand, or at least very effectively pretended, that he didn't understand basic economics. He did not understand that tariffs, or pretended not to understand that tariffs are a tax on Americans. Okay, it's a tax we pay our companies pay for importing Chinese goods. And for him, the whole measure of the relationship was what the trade imbalance or balance was. And since that's driven by many macroeconomic factors, not just cheating or absence of buying enough on one side or another, he just wanted to measure everything in how much stuff you guys are buying from us, and that was, so it was never going to be a serious dialogue, it seemed to me. So how should he have approached it, in my view? And this goes back to WTO negotiations. Trump made the struggle between the U.S. China basically a struggle between Trump and Xi over who could produce the biggest tariff, basically. And when you make the relationship Trump versus Xi, you trigger all Chinese nationalists and nationalism on Xi's side. My argument all along was you need to make it the world versus China on what are the right, fair, and just trade rules for the 21st century. When you do that, you trigger all kinds of Chinese reformers in that system, which is a very diverse system. Those of us who know China know it's not monolithic. You trigger them on your side, because many of them, see the problems and want to see China's economy thrive and modernize. And so I said before the last election, our recent presidential election, have no doubt, China and Russia are both voting Trump for the same two reasons. They know that as long as Trump is president, America is in chaos and therefore will never realize its full potential. And they know that as long as Trump is president, he can never galvanize a global coalition against China to actually create that united front of TPP, EU, America on universal, values. And Trump was incapable of doing that. And by the way, there were Chinese officials actually blurted that out loud. The one thing we fear is a global coalition. And it was the one thing Trump couldn't do. It is the first thing Joe Biden wants to do.
Great. So let's maybe transition a little bit into what you think we're going to see moving forward with the Biden presidency. And you did just have, the interview with him in the New York Times just 20 hours ago, as I was just reading it. So what's your sense for him? He's got a very deep bench of expertise. We know, everybody from the Obama administration is coming back in, as we see. They know China well, they know Asia well. What do you think are going to be the top 2 or 3 priorities for the administration moving forward?
So let's take it in 2 parts. Let's take, first of all, what he's inherited. He's inherited the phase 1 deal, and with 25% tariffs on about 50% of Chinese exports to the United States, as you said, about $300 billion worth of goods. And the president-elect has said, first, I just want to study that. Trump has left him real leverage in the form of, these 25% tariffs and a Chinese commitment now to buy $200 billion a year in U.S. goods and services over 2020 and 2021, for which they're quite far behind actually right now. So he's left him a lot of leverage on the table. And Biden, I think, rightly said, first of all, I just want to study this. I want to bring the best experts in. I hope you'll be one of them, Liz, and who just says, where are we here? Where are we? Number one. What, number 2, Biden says, I am going to sit down and reconstitute the alliance, both our Asia Pacific allies and the European Union. And everyone knows the European Union faces the exact same challenges that we do, and York can speak to that. And together, let's try to negotiate as a united front. Now, we all know, who have been through this relationship for a long time, that's easier said than done. There is a herding cats element here, and China understands this as well, and it will go on the biggest charm offensive ever right now. Oh God, in my next life, I want to be a European businessman right now, doing business with China, because the deals they're going to offer are going to be profound to basically prevent this alliance from cohering. So I'm not here to tell you that it will come off. That said, Trump these tariffs, they are on a lot of critical goods, machine tools and whatnot. Those tariffs now, Liz, I think they're almost 2 years old. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you start to get a shift. Where companies simply say, I'm gonna move some of that stuff back to America. I'm no longer gonna be dependent on China for this. So I think China's got to calculate very carefully here as well. But Biden's going to have a domestic move and an international move. The international move is build a global alliance. The domestic move is, oh, you're doing industrial policy? Well, we can do that too. And if you look at Congress right now, and China should really study this, there's a whole raft of bills by Republicans called Cornyn, Cotton, Hawley, Rubio for industrial policy, and from many Democrats in both the House and Senate. So the potential for a bipartisan industrial policy approach, and by this I simply mean massive U.S. government investment in R&D. And by the way, the semiconductor industry is really pushing for this. And one of the untold stories of the last 4 years is the degree to which the US semiconductor industry, we're not talking about a small industry, was at war with the Trump administration. They were at war with these guys over where this was going. And neither side sort of wanted to let it out because they were saying to Trump, now we shift a little bit from the tariffs to the cyber restrictions and the entities list. They were saying to him, okay, maybe we get Huawei, okay, a single company that's been a bad actor. But where you're going now is you're basically attacked when you're telling us we can't sell our chips. You're attacking their whole their whole tech sector. Where exactly is this going? Because most of our business is in China. Most of their purchases of chips are from us. If we get frozen out of there, they're just going to go to Korean and Japanese companies. Then we're going to have to compete with those companies in Europe where they have access to the Chinese market and the scale of that market, and we don't. So could you tell us exactly where this is going? At the same time, Trump had no clue of the degree of fusion of one country, two systems. Let's look at Qualcomm and Huawei. Here's Qualcomm's relationship to Huawei. For Qualcomm, Huawei was their customer, their supplier, their competitor, their partner, and their joint standard setter in the European semiconductor standard setting bodies. They have 5 different relationships with Huawei. Now, Trump had no clue of this. So suddenly you come along and you say China's an enemy. You can't do business with Huawei. And they're saying, I've got 5 different relationships with Huawei. So there, and you alluded to this. I like the way you put it, Liz, and I don't remember exactly how you did it, but we have to have if you want to go down that tech war road, you need to be very targeted. Otherwise, you are going to end up with a digital Berlin Wall, a 2 technology universe of China and America. And not that it's easy for China. They're pouring huge money into making semiconductors. They've never been able to do it. They've never been able to do it. And I'm not saying they won't be able to, but it's very, very difficult. But if they can, wow. I mean, that will fundamentally reshape the relationship. So I think if we're going to go down this road, we need to be very targeted and you need to be very specific. I'm ready to believe anything about Huawei. I went to Shenzhen. I interviewed Mr. Ren last September before all this started. I don't know but all I know is that when I Google Huawei, the first thing that comes up is actually from WikiLeaks, where Snowden has leaked the fact that we actually broke into Huawei's back door in Pakistan in order to penetrate, their system. So it is a little bit rich for us to be saying, oh my God, Huawei, they will give everything to the PLA. That'll be like a vacuum cleaner suction tube from every American company to China when, the lady doth protest too much. So at some point, we have to sit down and say, what is strategic? What is really important? What has to be protected? And what you just have to say, hey, this is thinking you have any privacy in this world we're going into is really naive. And if we are going to act like every Chinese company is an outpost of the PLA, then we're going to create a two technology universe, us and China. And I'm not sure which universe York and his friends will decide to join. Don't be sure that is our side of that digital Berlin Wall. So I am so glad our president-elect is saying, whoa, let's sit down and ask, where are we and where are we going here? Because this is really complicated.
No, I agree. I think you're exactly right. You've put your finger on perhaps the most important point, which is, where does it all end actually?
Yeah.
Once you start going down this technological
right.
rabbit hole,
Yeah.
everything becomes some
Dual
form of a
use. Yeah.
national security risk, right?
Yeah.
I would be interested in York's answer to your question, by the way, of
Yeah.
where does York land, on which side of the Berlin Wall. I feel frankly as though, we've gotten lucky in the United States over the past 4 years, because had China done a better job, had its diplomacy been better, more sophisticated, more engaging, we could have been really sunk. As it is, with their wolf warrior diplomacy, the way they managed some of the diplomacy over the pandemic, they shot themselves in the foot and kept us alive for President-elect Biden to come in. But let me just push you a tiny bit more on this issue, because it does take us into an area we haven't discussed yet, which is the issue of China as a security threat. And I think part of the reason that the administration, not President Trump, let's put him aside, because I think, as you suggested earlier, he pretty much cared about one thing, and that was the bilateral trade deficit and rectifying that in his mind. But I think for some of his other somewhat more sophisticated thinkers in the National Security Council, Defense Department, there was a sense that China, had very dramatically, enhanced,
escalated,
military capabilities, right? And that the technology aspect of that was essential. And so that the whole semiconductor issue is less about Huawei per se,
right?
Or Huawei phone, or 5G is important, but also those undersea cables and other issues. It's about the military aspects of what the semiconductors also provide. And so I'm just wondering, do you think that we should be concerned about China as a security threat, even beyond cyber economic espionage? Does it pose a real security threat to US interests?
I know I should be more worried about this than I am, but I always just ask myself a simple question. What are we, like, are they going to occupy Chinatown in LA, take over Grumman's Chinese Theater? I mean, like, what is it? Are they going to impose what on us? Capitalism? Because that's their system. You know what I mean? It's like, I sort of scratch my head and ask, what does winning for them look like? Literally, is it governing San Francisco? Is it imposing Confucian institutes on every American campus? I honestly, I don't know what we're fighting about. You know what I mean? It's like, I get it, and its influence and its power, and I'm big and you're small and you can come through my shipping lane. But this is not like the Cold War, where you literally faced an alternative ideological system that pretended, at least, to want to impose that system, Marxist-Leninism, on first Eastern Europe, then Western Europe, and then us. So this is just such a classic, just sort of two big sumo wrestlers wrestling, but I'm not sure what the winner gets. I don't. And so where would China be today if it couldn't trade with America? If it wasn't nourished by our economy? Where would we be if we weren't also nourished by theirs? So I just think we so need a timeout, a step back, and simply say, look, where can we cooperate? Where do we compete? How do we compete? But also, as you suggested, Liz, a deep question of, well, what is privacy? What is security in a world where everything is digital, and therefore anything can be hacked from anywhere, including this conversation. And so I just choose to live my life by saying, I don't even swear in email. I don't even use bad language in email. I just assume everything is going to be on a billboard. And that's what I do. Yeah, I just, because otherwise you make yourself crazy, because every device you're carrying, every pair of glasses, every watch, you're walking hackathon basically. And so I think we need to have a kind of a real sit down with them, because we can actually drive them crazy. We can drive ourselves crazy, and they can drive themselves crazy. And President Obama started that conversation a little bit with them. And the Trump era, we stopped it, but we really do need to almost define the limits of our competition now, for their sake and for ours. And it's going to take and that's what I mean when I say this 40-year period's over. That was kind of an industrial revolution period, China growing from poverty to middle income by selling shallow goods. Now we're in a digital era where China can make deep goods. We don't have shared values, so we therefore need a ring fence where we really don't share values, and we need to maybe learn to share some values where we don't, for both of our sakes. But we really need to reconfigure this relationship. Otherwise, we're both going to squander. We're going to make each other poorer, and in the process, we will make the world poorer, and we will make the world less stable.
Yeah.
Oh, may I just
wise words. I know York. Okay, York. I know. I sense you want to jump in. All right, jump in.
First of all, Tom, I have to defend the Russians, of course.
Sorry.
It's not just which is very good. It's
yes.
also which they have, but it's not much else. I must admit. Let me point out that maybe it's very strange, as China is trying to reach out. They are inadvertently building coalitions. I mean, 17 plus 1, for example, was such a big hype, and everyone in Eastern Europe was so excited. And now basically it leaves them with 2 countries that are sort of still positive towards China. The rest is bitterly disappointed about lack of investment, lack of exports. And now, if you transport this into our region here, it's Australia, of course. You know how they
shocking
Australia, how that is a lesson to the world in order to see, they have a free trade agreement with Australia. They just signed RCEP at the same time. They whack them around because they happen to be a small country, I mean, population-wise. So in a way, I was wondering how the world should respond to this. I mean, there is Quad being discussed, India, Japan, US, and I think it's Australia, sort of a body which meant nothing really, but all of a sudden, because of China, gains in importance. And then, of course, RCEP. I mean, the media talks about a massive free trade agreement. It's actually not. It's just straightening out bilateral agreements minus what you had in TPP, meaning social and environmental areas. So how do you see this coalition building ability from the Chinese side, and how should we basically respond to this?
York, I was involved in a private dialogue at Tsinghua 2 years ago, a kind of, what do they call them, third way or whatever, group of Chinese, track 2, group of Chinese scholars on one side, some government people, and myself is now Ferguson and Martin Wolf and a couple others on the other side. And when we began, because I consider myself a friend of this relationship, not that I believe the relationship is vital to the stability and prosperity of the world. I'm in that school of Americans who want to build bridges where possible, draw red lines where necessary. It seems to me the only logical way to deal with China. But I was giving my presentation somewhat like I just did with Liz, and calling out bad behavior. And an official on the Chinese side said to me, and this is pretty much a direct quote, it's in my column, "Mr. Friedman, you're too late. We're too big." I said, oh, excuse me. That's not humble. That's not humble. Be very, very careful about that. And I never forgot that. And that's what's playing out with Australia right now. And that will galvanize a coalition against them. I really, to me, biggest question the Chinese Council on Foreign Relations, if there is such a thing, should be asking is who lost America? Who lost Hank Paulson? You know, who lost Tom Friedman? These people weren't like silly gaga, but just people said, hey, there's an important relationship. We need to maintain it. You know, draw red lines where necessary. You know, they're losing every friend they have in Washington, D.C. I can't imagine what's going on in Canberra now, but I don't think it has a lot of friends there. Now, you do that with enough countries, and you have the whole world galvanized against you. So my question is, if I were in China now, and I look forward to going, and by the way, I spoke at the China Development Forum, I just spoke at the Globalization, Center's, big conference. They keep inviting me to these things, at least digitally. But if I do get a visa and can come back, I mean, I come back with one question: what the hell are you guys doing? I mean, how does this end well for you? You know, when you completely alienate everyone in Australia. A lot of the FT just did a whole piece on what's going on in the European Union, and be humble, be humble. You got a good thing going. Be humble. Don't overreach, because you're producing American industrial policy. You're producing coalitions against you. How's that going to work out? You know. So I frankly, I look at what's going on in Australia, and I just say, that's just insane. Why would you treat a country like that, make it that kind of object lesson? Because all you're going to get is passive aggressive behavior and response, even from your friends, or your so-called friends. So I am really confused as who's designing this policy and where they think it's going and how they think it's going to end well. That the world are all going to become vassals of the Middle Kingdom. I don't think so. I don't think so. Just as China sometimes forget, because they speak about a century of humiliation and their pride. Guess what? Aussies have pride too. Vietnamese have pride too. Indonesians have pride too. Americans have pride too. Europeans have pride too. Be careful. You can really break something.
Yeah. Maybe before Liz comes up with the next question, ask our members, please do start chipping in your questions in the chat box. Rachel is monitoring it in Shanghai, and she's going to read out the questions to Tom. So Liz, over to you.
Sure. And actually, Tom, I think, the Chinese have sort of a thought in their heads that, you shoot one to scare 100. And,
right, interesting, yeah.
Part of what might be going on here is, I think they're shooting Australia and scaring 100,
right.
but
yeah.
I don't think that's what's happening. As you suggest, I think the opposite is true.
Yeah.
And, you are having a coalition form around Australia at this point.
Yeah.
And, but I would say, where is it coming from? It only comes from one place, and that's the very top.
Yeah.
This is
absolutely, yeah.
This is only
that's clear.
coming out of Xi Jinping and down
Yeah.
through the system. But let's turn a little bit to the EU and talk about what is the potential for U.S. and EU to work together on China, do you think? I think there are probably some areas of common ground. Maybe there's some areas where there's not. I think in a piece I read a while ago said something like, basically going to the EU is you've got to go through Germany first.
Yeah.
So what is that? Work on China, you've got to go through Germany. So I know that's all for you, York. What is that?
The point I was making is that the Cold War was really fought and won in Berlin. The Cold War with Russia, and I believe the Cold War with China will be fought and won in Berlin. That is. Where Berlin goes is where Germany goes. Where Germany goes is where the EU goes. And Germany, we forget, it's a manufacturing superpower. And Trump's, again, his inability to focus and prioritize. He got caught up in aluminum and auto tariffs in EU countries and Germany, and not really, really that the much bigger prize is how we revamp and make mutually productive for EU, America, and China that relationship, and that takes leverage. Negotiating with China without leverage is like playing baseball without a bat. Okay, your hand starts to hurt after a while. You know what I mean? And one thing about the Chinese is they can guess your power from 100 yards away. Oh, they down to the last gram, and they've had to in order to survive. As a country that's been invaded by foreign powers, and you do develop that DNA, and so it just seems to me that you've got to have a German, U.S., Korea, Japan. This is sort of the real Taiwan, the real weight there, and India. And then you start to have a real conversation. By the way, again, I'm not for containment. I want this relationship to work. I go back these 40 years. We are going to miss them when they're gone. We will realize how much prosperity and how much stability they brought to the world. And China used to be a real proliferator. It's not a proliferator anymore. China helped us on the Iran deal. China helped us on climate. So they are in evolution. What we've stopped, I think, on our side, and they did through a change in leadership, I would say on their side, is I think their evolution has slowed down. And we've given up some of our leverage in enhancing that. And there's been a deliberate, change at the top there, policy, in terms of control and controlling the Communist Party, which I think is going to be very dangerous for China, because I think we're going to a world that is what I call fast, fused, and deep. Just the pace of technological change really fast, fused, more and more globalization, really, really deep in terms of technology. And in a world where change is happening really fast, open systems have an increasingly big advantage. They get all the signals first, and they attract the most high IQ risk takers. And it's people who get the signals first and have the most high IQ risk takers. Liz, if we weren't having an election now and weren't caught up in everything Trump, we just had one of the biggest business stories in the world happen, that the Ant IPO was crushed by the government. Holy mackerel. I mean, if all this other stuff wasn't going on, that is what we'd be talking about. And who knows what reverberations that sends out to the little starter upper who says, geez, do I want to do that here? And so that was a big, big story.
It is a big
So
story.
that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, maybe I just asked Rachel. She got two questions. One is from my friend Sutta. So Rachel, maybe one by one.
Okay, thanks, Jörg. For Tom, the first question from one of our attendees, you characterized Trump as a breaker, not a builder. How would you characterize the present Chinese leader? And given that he is tipped to be in that position for a very long time, what does that tell us about the likely trajectory of China's relations with the world?
They're so different as leaders in such different systems. All I know is that I think Deng Xiaoping understood something very important, that when you have a leader like a Mao for however many decades that he ruled, you narrow the aperture to the leadership. You narrow the number of people who can move to the top, and you narrow the information flow. And therefore, Deng, and I think an amazing achievement, basically put in place a system of rotating power that brought constantly fresh talent, gave opportunity for fresh talent to come in and rise, and kept the flow of information much broader and not focused on a single individual. So I'm not going to comment on Xi personally. Honestly, I don't know that much about him. All I know is when you make yourself emperor for life or president for life, you better be really, really good. Yeah, there's occasionally a Lee Kuan Yew who comes along, who's like really, really good. Okay, but what you can do in a city state and what you can do across a continental-sized country with 1.3 billion people, that's very different. And so I'm just going to fall back on the wisdom of Deng Xiaoping.
Rachel?
I think he knew something.
Thank you, Tom. Our next question is from Sitao Xu at Deloitte. What areas in the very short run can the U.S. and China work together, notwithstanding the fact that China has to make many adjustments in order to repair the relationship? What adjustment does the Biden administration need to make?
I'd like to hear Liz on that, frankly. I really would.
Okay, but I mean, obviously, this is about you, Tom.
No,
I
this
think,
is about you.
No, it really isn't. I think the issues that most frequently come up are obviously climate change, pandemics, working in third countries on issues like public health. So I think, it's a little bit of a retreat back to, the Obama days. But I think areas of global challenge and areas that don't tend to touch on what the Chinese and the US, I think both consider to be core interests, are probably the easiest places for the two countries to start working together. It does beg the question of what does that cooperation actually look like? What does it mean? Because it's easy to say, oh, we need to cooperate on climate change. To my mind, it would just mean, for example, that the United States and China would step up with much more ambitious targets than they've already put in place. I don't consider the sort of carbon neutral by 2060 to be a hugely ambitious target for China at this point in time, and certainly not capping emissions by 2030. So, I think they need to do more. We obviously can step up and do more because we haven't, said or pledged to do anything at this point. So, and I think we will have a pretty ambitious climate program emerging out of the Biden administration. So I think that's the way to start. And then the Chinese have to take a step back from all of their export of coal-fired power plants and other things they're doing. On the pandemic, I'll say very quickly, the Chinese are very eager in all of the track 2 dialogues that I participated. The first thing out of the Chinese mouths, what kind of positive signal can they send, is always, we can help you with addressing the pandemic. I don't think that that's the way it's going to work. I do think that working through COVAX and other things, we can work jointly together to help. But I don't know that the U.S. is going to be receptive to the lessons learned from China at this point in time. I don't think that's the way that the relationship's going to be improved. So I would just, I'll leave it there. But Tom, perhaps you have some other ideas.
No, that's good. I learned something from that. So that I would just leave it at that. I can't.
Maybe I can just chip in the experience we had last night. We had our 20th anniversary party. The vice premier came along with 5 vice ministers. And the theme we had was geographic indication, a deal that was signed between China and the European Union in September. So we lined up all the Irish whiskey, all the Bordeaux and all the Parma ham and so forth. So it was really something tangible, visible, where you can see, now these products on the Chinese side, lots of tea and Baijiu is protected. So I'm really trying to see that we have to get things done because there's so much rhetoric out there. WTO is a topic, WHO reform that can be done with the US, as well as climate change. I mean, China has to shut down 660 gigawatt of coal-fired power stations. That's the entire energy fleet of Europe. So China, while still having an increase in energy consumption per capita, has to basically shut down Europe and turn it into a renewable success story. So I guess there's also a topic because failure is around the corner. I mean, we have this investment agreement going. I'm less optimistic every day. It's very hard to see how that bridge between, ILO conditions, forced labor, and China's wish not to have its system changed is going to be bridged. So in a way, I think we should have a couple of bridges built, not just one, because if one breaks down, then basically the gulf is big.
York, I have a question for you, and it comes out of this conversation with Biden. What do you think are the prospects for real EU-US cooperation, not to contain China, but to have a united negotiating front that is much more powerful?
Well, I guess that the Europeans have signaled, in particular, Germans have signaled that actually they would like to cooperate again. I think it takes a while in order to rebuild trust it's in areas like how do we deal with Russia, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, in other areas where we have to find common ground. How do we deal with Southeast Asia? The Germans just came out with a policy statement how to deal with this one. I guess we have to first look, as said, step back, look into where we have common ground. And China is definitely top of the list because China is an economic superpower. It is very different in its system. It appears to be on autopilot and not really listening to us. And maybe it helps. And the chamber is building together. We are doing a survey with a study coming out on January 14th, a week before Biden's inauguration, on decoupling. And there, of course, also India matters. The decoupling that they are now trying to achieve on pharmaceuticals to be less dependent on APIs. So decoupling is going to be the big story, and we have to see, as you pointed out in the beginning, how we do this without shooting in our foot.
Yeah, interesting. That's very helpful.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting to consider the extent to which a Biden administration might try to knit together the EU and Asia, because our partnerships in Asia actually remain reasonably robust. You talked about the Quad, reasonably robust throughout the Trump administration. So you even saw some Asian countries, I would say, that kind of were hoping that Trump might win because because
it's a good point, Liz.
Trump himself. But again, his administration was very committed to the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific and bolstering military relations, for example. And so now you have, I think, Biden looking to repair the relationship with the EU, which was definitely hurt under the Trump administration. So the question emerges, are there opportunities for Europe, I think, to engage more deeply in Asia, not just in trade, which is where they've always kind of been traditionally focused, but more broadly. Is that a possibility to sort of really build bridges, across from the Atlantic through the Pacific? I think that might be something that we would see moving forward as well.
I mean, Europe has a couple of very deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, and they go way beyond what RCEP has to offer. And they're sitting down with the Indonesians and others now in order to see if then get going. I think it would be very good if the US would join from the other side and also reach out in order to have a deeper economic things. I mean, the appetite for cooperation you can see on the RCEP is so far that even Australia was willing to enter that fray, even though they get slaughtered right now by China. It's very interesting to see.
Interesting.
That's interesting. Rachel, is there another question?
Yes, our next question. How do you think China's Belt and Road Initiative will fare if there is indeed a rising international coalition? Will those taking part in the Belt and Road Initiative not likely be part of that coalition?
I'm going to defer to you, Liz, on that. I don't know really much about Belt and Road, to be honest.
Okay, I'll be very brief. The Belt and Road at this point can include every country in the world. But I think, the question actually is a really important one because one of the issues is that we talk all the time about the EU and the US and its major partners in Asia, like Japan, Australia, to a lesser extent, India. And a point, frankly, that I make a lot is that we really need to reach out more to the rest of the world, the developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Because when you look at what takes place, for example, in the United Nations on votes to do with Xinjiang or South China Sea or Hong Kong most recently, you see that the US and the EU can rally 20, 30 countries behind their perspective, and China will bring 50 countries from the Middle East and Africa to support its position. And so we make a mistake, I think, when we sort of only think about our close friends and allies, and we don't think more broadly, because the sort of China is a global challenge, a global issue, and we have to play on the global stage, I think, as well. So my hope is that actually this kind of discussion that we're having now will also begin to include a much broader range of countries. So point well taken.
Well, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative was topic of a study from the European Chamber in January, which got lost basically in COVID. But basically the message was it is not much in there for foreign companies because 90% is Chinese that ends up in China. So the value added, it's like an export of their procurement model. But at the same time, I guess also the problem for the Chinese now is they raise so high expectations that they have to now face the fact that people are actually turning critical to China. And I guess they would be well advised to actually work with US and Europe in Africa together. The last thing we need is now to have a situation in a couple of years that resembles Angola from the 1970s. We really don't want that. I guess we have two more questions or one more question. Rachel, it's your own one. Please chip it in.
Yeah, so my question is, how do you see Hong Kong and Taiwan playing out, especially as we've seen support from Hong Kong and Taiwanese towards Trump because of his approach towards the CCP? So what do you see under Biden going forward?
Well, of course, I'm deeply saddened to see what's happened to the Democrats in Hong Kong. That said, I'm going to give you a slightly realpolitik answer, Rachel, which is that Taiwan's always been one of my favorite countries. I mean, a barren rock in a typhoon-laden sea with, like, I don't know, the 8th largest financial reserves in the world. I mean, it's an amazing place. I've been going there for, I don't know, at least 30 years, and so much has changed in Taiwan over those 30 years. It's amazing. There's only one thing that hasn't changed. It's geography. It's still a tiny rock off a massive Chinese mainland. And Hong Kong's geography hasn't changed either. And countries that forget their geography, sometimes things end badly. And Taiwan, because they've been so successful, and I truly admire what they have built, but they can be suckers for any sort of magic potion hustler in Washington, D.C., who bats an eye at them and sort of embraces them, of course, for a small fee. And they need to be very, very careful not to be deluded by these characters into thinking that we're going to back them up, that we're going to, they are still a small island nation off the coast of a massive Chinese mainland. And I would just tread lightly. As for Hong Kong, all these democracy movements, this is part of a global pattern. I was there in September, and I did my usual thing. I said to our local bureau, I'd really like to meet the leaders of the Occupy Central movement, or the democracy movement at that time. And they said, well, there are no leaders. It's leaderless. I said, yeah, but they have 5 demands. They said, well, those were crowdsourced. I said, really? I've actually been to that play. It was called the Arab Spring. Who decides when we should actually compromise on demand number 4 in order to secure demands number 1, 2, and 5? And of course, what happened in the Arab Spring was there was no one who could do that. And so it ended really badly. It pains me to see what happened in Hong Kong. But you can, even as a democracy movement, given the context you're living in, overplay your hand and not achieve and go for the compromise that is still on the table. And I fear, that may be what happens. You have to always be gauging the balance of power when you're a tiny island off mainland China and America is far, far away. And I say this with sadness and huge respect for the courage of what people did. It's awesome, but you're up against a brutal, tough, merciless regime that is not going to allow your movement to spark, broader movements inside their mainland. And so you've got to be calibrating. And in the old days, a movement where everyone was mimeographing papers together and working in a cellar somewhere and talking all the time on the phone and even meeting, clandestinely, you could sort of figure out where those compromises are. But when you've got one of these Facebook online things where there's basically no leader and all the demands are crowdsourced, that's really complicated when you're living in the context of Hong Kong vis-a-vis China. And so to me, it's an object lesson. Again, I was at this play in Tahrir Square. It's exactly what happened. It's why I've never romanticized these movements. Oh, it's great. Facebook is just fantastic for getting people into the streets, and it is hell for getting them to agree on a single position. And I think you really saw that play out.
Fellows, 1 hour, and for you it's getting really late. I guess it's now 10 o'clock or something like this PM.
Yeah, I'm gonna crash and burn.
I think you should have a nightcap and then go to bed. I just, at the end, so started with soccer, would like to end with another picture I learned from my old friend Tim Stratford, whom you will know well.
Tim, I know exactly. He's wonderful.
Yes, and it's the picture about that, China and us, we play football, but their version is the American football version. Top gear and pushing 4 meters, having timeout, having these guys on the sidelines strategizing and so forth. Whereas we in the liberal European world try to play soccer and try to sort of abide to the rules and have this kind of non-physical contact and so forth. And Tim was really giving me this idea, and I must say it sticks, that actually we might talk about the same thing, but have very different meaning attached to this. Anyhow, Liz, thank you so much for staying up late and doing this moderation. And Tom, thank you so much for doing this. We're looking forward to your next spectacular interview. And I don't know, is there a book in the making?
I'm working on a bunch of things right now. Nothing's quite crystallized yet. But I'm thinking about a lot of things. So I'm nothing quite ready yet. But thank you for asking.
So good night to you both, and thank you for everyone dialing in. Thank you so much. Good night, and stay alert.